Okay. So today we're going to start kind of by defining what sociology is, what the main focus of this area of study is. And if you break down the word even in Greek, it kind of makes sense. Soci means social, socialness. Ology means study. So it's a pretty easy word to break down in its Greek form. But what is it that sociologists study? Okay. And again, it's all about groups and group membership and how we influence each other, either as a collective bunch or as for example, someone who's a leader or someone who is in an authority figure space and how they influence how people behave within that system. Okay. And we'll also get into one major area of sociology is what about people who dissent from, for example, authority or the culture? What is it? A lot of times in popular culture, we call it the fringe people, right? What is it about them that lets them develop that identity outside the mainstream, whatever it may be? So it's kind of a study of society on the large end. And in between is the science involving the study of our how we live as people in groups. Okay. Um, if we looked at it from, for example, a neuroscience perspective, this is an important study because human beings are meant to be social beings. We literally could not exist without each other. Okay. And some examples from neuroscience is the example of what's known as what's called the default network in the frontal lobe of your brain. Okay. Throughout most of history, humans have assumed that your frontal lobe is the center of rationality. It's what gives us our ability to solve math problems, build skyscrapers, fly to the moon, all of those kind of uh, cognitive rational tasks. Okay. But over the last couple of decades, we've learned something very unique about our frontal lobe is that um, if we uh, squished your frontal lobe into an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper, okay, and we set a quarter on top of it, that quarter is what helps people build skyscrapers, solve math problems, do all of those other things. The other part of that paper is what's known as the default network. Okay. What do I mean by that? Okay. A common study paradigm is we do something like this. We hook up some probes to your brain and we have you start doing math problems. Okay. And during that time, that little quarter area starts to become active. And then let's say when I say stop, you put your pin down instantly. And then when I say go, you pick your pin back up and you start doing those problems again. Okay. Sometimes I will do it for a fraction of a second. Stop, go. Okay. Sometimes I might wait a few minutes. Sometimes I might even wait several 20 minutes. Okay. But what we find is that regardless of how much time we give you, even within the half of a second, that quarter shuts off and that default network starts becoming active. Okay. That default network is also the network that involves social thinking. When you're thinking about other people and you're thinking about your relationship between you and other people, it comes on automatically when you stop thinking about thinking. And it is the area of the brain that helps us navigate our social and complex world. That's one aspect of neuroscience that kind of shows our social being. Okay. One of my favorite is because in my professional life before academics, I worked with survivors of domestic violence, sexual abuse, and relationship violence. And I always was interested. I kind of understood the whole dark side of intimate relationships. But I had this other academic side that really wanted to know why the hell we get together in the first place, other than to have kids, right? And so I came into studying that right when some very significant neuroscience experiments were happening. And again, this is the simple paradigm. If you look at most psychological theories on intimate love, they're emotion based. They explain love in that guise of it's an emotion, and therefore, because it's an emotion, it should be controllable. Okay. And so when they originally started to scan the brain for the seat of intimate love, they thought it was going to be in the limbic system where the amygdala is, which just sits right underneath the cortex. Okay. And they were wrong. Okay. If we put you, if you say you're totally in love with this person, they're your world, and we put you in an MRI and we flash pictures of your love object versus pictures of random things. Okay. What you would expect if intimacy was an emotion is that the limbic system and the paralimbic system, the system between that and the cortex, would start to become active. But interestingly, that's not what becomes active. Actually, your brain stem becomes active, the area between your spinal cord and your higher brain. The brain stem is also associated with autonomic functions like hunger, thirst, heartbeat, respiration, digestion. All of those things that we don't think about, but are the basic survival needs for a human being to survive, is what becomes active when we are wanting and seeking out intimate love, and becomes even more active when we lose that love. And that's probably why we become so crazy when we break up with someone, because it's almost like people taking food, water, and air away from you. Okay. But again, I'm going on this idea that human beings are social beings, right? So if that's one of our most basic and almost automatic drives, that tells us that humans are meant to be with other humans, right? Another more negative research that kind of indicates how social we are is some research that Nazis did during World War II, where they took individuals, and there's other evidence beyond this, but it's the one that makes for good stories. Um, they took individuals and they put them in these spaces. In the spaces, they had all the food and water they needed. They had all the warmth and comforts that would biologically sustain an individual. Okay. The thing that they did not give the individual access to is any type of contact with another human being. They couldn't hear, see, or smell or touch another person. And it's interesting what happened to these individuals is they didn't necessarily go psychologically crazy, but within 72 hours, they started to go through hypothermia, even though there was no reason to have hypothermia. They started to have thirst issues. They couldn't drink enough waters because their body started to dehydrate itself. And they started to decompensate as if the person was dying of hunger. And the cure for it was someone simply walking into the room and another human being there. And within a few hours, they were back out of that state. Okay. So, literally, physically, human beings are such social human beings that we literally can't exist without other people in our world. Okay. Which is probably when we're lonely, we think about other people, read, watch TV, get on social media, because those are all outlets to allow us to kind of overcome those issues. So, but I just want to emphasize that point because that's what sociology really is trying to emphasize is that all these group dynamics, the bad, the good, they're all part of the human process and who we are as a species. Okay. So we want to know how they function and why they function the way they do. And it's also a scientific study of the aggregate, the entities through which we move throughout their lives. So we all have different identities. Right now, we have, students, right? But here in an hour or two, you might be in an RA role. You might be with your friends. You might be at work. You might be in another class. And so you're going to transition an identity. And how do we do this seamlessly with staying the same person? And that is very unique to the human species. Okay. Most species, for example, if we take other social beings like ants and bees, a worker bee does not become a building bee or a mother bee. They stick within their single role. In ants, you have the army ants, you have the work ants, you have, and what you're born into, that's what you are. You don't transition like humans do from one role to the next role to the next role. And so sociology wants to know how humans move throughout those different social aggregates that we have. And it even starts with things like hierarchies. So how do we move through governmental systems and family systems? And how do we manage that? Okay. I know that seems like a simple answer as human beings, but if you think about it as a cross comparison between us and other species, it's really a significant thing that humans do moving from role to role to role. So that's another thing that sociology is awesomely interested in. To kind of put it in within the social sciences, if we put anthropology, anthropology is that overarching type of science. It wants to know how cultures lived, what was their main kind of belief systems and ideas, and how did they manage their day-to-day life from food to who does labor, who does what. It kind of gives us that overall kind of like the a picture, right? Of a group of people. If we're imagining a picture and there's a bunch of people in there, okay? Sociology looks at that picture and they recognize that there's groups within that pictures. So there's maybe family over here, there's people jogging. Let's say it's a park thing, and maybe there's a bunch of joggers over here, yoga people over here. And sociology comes in and says, we know what the overall themes of people in a park are, as an anthropologist would say, but a sociologist wants to know what is the system within the yoga people? What is the system within the joggers? What is the system within the family? And why is it they still come to this common area and can interact with each other, even though they have different purposes? Okay. What is it that makes a person a yoga person versus a jogger? Okay. And why do they affiliate with the groups that they affiliate? That's sociology. Psychology is looking at a single person within that picture of everyone else. They want to know how that person thinks, feels, and behaves in their world. What is it about them that made them choose the yoga people over the jogger people? What makes them unique to any of the other group members that they're with? Okay. And that's psychology. They're more focused on the individual, their own behaviors, attitudes, beliefs, cognitions, and all of those things. So this class is kind of that middle ground. We'll kind of talk about both the overarching and the individual things to kind of see why it is we come together, we develop groups, we develop who we are. Okay. Now, one of the things that from even the beginning of sociology and its development is that there is two themes that seem to uh, define every group process. And when I talk about group, it could be a couple, it could be two friends, or again, it can be an entire culture. But within any type of social interaction, there tends to be two forces that um, influence both. The first one is consensus. This is where people share things like norms, values, those kinds of things. And when we get to talking more depth about consensus, we have to understand that we both have literal consensus and we have what are called psychological social contracts with each other. Okay. So, and the difference is that they both can be shared equally and obeyed equally no matter what. So, for example, on the literal end, we're talking, speed limit, uh, pay your taxes. Um, I don't know what other laws are there. Don't kill anybody. Don't don't steal. All of those are literal laws, right? That are written in a book somewhere that says, "Thou shalt not do this, or this will be the consequence." Excuse you. So within any group, we have that. In this classroom, we have the class syllabus, right? And we have those policies. Those are our literal rules for the class. So I can't get up in the middle of the class and slap someone. You don't have to worry about that because we have a literal rule that says you'll get fired and probably put in jail. Okay. Same with you, with me too. You can't do that to me either. Okay. But it's a rule that we've established. Okay. But we also have the psychological social contract. All right. Now, usually your professor, I don't know if we do this anymore. Usually a professor is standing in the middle of the room on top of a podium and students are sitting down and taking notes, right? That's that, but there's no rule that says that is how it's supposed to be. I was trying to show this in a social psychology class once. So before class, I went and I just took one of the student desks and put it in the middle of the room and I cleaned out the rest of the classroom. And I just sat at that student desk and literally students didn't know what to do when they walked in the classroom. They looked around, they saw me at the student desk. Half of them just walked back out. Others just kind of stood there like, what are we supposed to do? Reason is that I violated our psychological contract with each other that says this is how a professor should act, this is how the student should behave. Okay. And we do those not based on this, we came to class the first day and made this decision. It is just something we do because that's the contract, that's the norm, that's the values, right? And so and we have this all the time in throughout our world and how we interact with each other. So when we talk about consensus throughout this class, we'll talk about those literal consensuses and why people violate them, why people follow them. But we'll also talk about things like social norms and those things that aren't legally binding. There's no written rules behind them, but why do we follow them? Okay. And we'll specifically talk about that when we get to things like persuasion, obedience to authority, um, social influence. Why is it that someone can twist what would be a normal social norm to get a person to do something that is against their morals or against their best judgment? And we'll talk about that when we get to that section about how people can violate these psychological contracts to get people to do things they really wouldn't do if they didn't have that influence. Okay. The second thing that sociologists have found that is a kind of a theme or a quality of every social interaction is conflict. Um, Conflict usually comes out of inequality or power between two individuals. And in a lot of ways creates this kind of life and death difference. And we'll talk about, for example, when we get to conflict theory, the main idea behind it is that the earth has limited resources. Okay. Knowing that it has limited resources, making sure that you get your piece of the pie is important, knowing that it's not going to last, quote unquote, forever. And so this naturally will create conflict between people because it's going to create a power difference between those who have and those who don't have. And again, I'm going to kind of go back to the idea of consensus. This can be literal and this could be psychological. On the literal level, we can go to places of low social economic status, of low social economic upbringing, and we can find in those areas there are not a lot of resources, there's not a lot of jobs, there's not a lot of ways people can become mobile. And so that that literal system that exists within that space then can create a power difference between those who don't and those who do. Okay, so that's a literal component of things such as inequality. There can also be the psychological inequality. Okay, and this is when a group usually is of their own self-destruction, finds themselves in a position where they feel that they're losing power, even though they may not be. But because they feel that loss of power due to their own kind of detriment, they need to find another group to blame for it. Okay. Another group that says it's because of them that I don't have. Okay. And we can kind of look at current trends here in the United States. If we look at, for example, this fight about illegal immigrants, especially those from Latin America, is there a literal evidence that people from Latin America that come here legally or illegally are creating violence, taking jobs, ruining the healthcare system and everything else? If you look at every literal measure, no. Okay. If we look at when we get to violence and deviance, we will see that 89% of homicides and murders in the United States happen among American citizens within their own family and social system. It's not an outsider coming in and killing people. It's us killing our own people. If we look at it from a very literal perspective, okay? But what is happening? Okay, there is kind of a shift in the United States where it was actually predicted to happen by now, but it looks like it'll probably be around 2030, where white Caucasian European Americans will be in the minority, not the majority anymore. And so they're feeling this pressure. Again, if I'm talking from a conflict sociological perspective, there's this pressure that I am losing power. I am losing my place. And because I can't, because it's kind of psychologically taxing, I'm not going to blame it on what's really wrong. I'm going to blame it on another group that's an easy target. And so currently, right now, we can see that target being quote unquote illegal immigrants. Okay. And so, in the sociological world, um, and when we talk about, again, extremists and all of those things, literal fact doesn't meet the conflict interest. Does that make sense? Okay. Um, And of course, we can go through history and see all kinds of groups that were blamed for problems that weren't theirs in the first place. But we'll get to that later in the course. Now, the issue is so if conflict is this destructive force, why does it exist? Okay. Well, while conflict can result in really awful things happening, wars and discrimination and prejudice, conflict also is a building point because if we didn't have conflict, we wouldn't exert change. We wouldn't grow and develop. We wouldn't probably have went from the agriculture phase to the city-state phase to all the other phases that have given technology and modern world what it is. Okay, so while conflict on its extreme dangerous end can result in harm to people, it is also a catalyst for change in the other direction as well. And so we feel that, we can't always agree with each other because if we agree with each other, we're not going to evolve, we're not going to change, we're not going to solve problems. And so both consensus and conflict are necessary for a civil group, but yet a group that will still grow and develop. Does that make sense? All right. So I mentioned on Tuesday that one of the different approaches from a sociological perspective is they use a type of reasoning where you start with a broader picture. Okay. You start with this idea. This is the reason why this is happening with these people. Okay. And then you go into that group and you go into that place and you see if there's evidence for or against that idea. Okay. And that's a little bit different than other scientific endeavors. For example, psychology starts with the experiment that then builds the theory. In sociology, we use a theory to develop the experiment. Okay. So, we're going to go over some theories. The first ones, of course, are the ones that you would learn in most Social 101 classes. They're very Western white theories, as you will probably see. But one thing we will do in this class is we will also add some more kind of modern indigenous theories that have been developed over the last about 30 years, which provides a little bit different perspective than the ones we'll go over for that you would find in your regular mainstream textbook. So we'll kind of treat all of it. So again, just to kind of give some light to this thing is I would encourage you as you go through this to think about your way of thinking about life and what you would think that your community, your people would think about these different ideas and different approaches. Some will agree with, others maybe not, but we'll kind of look at these as we move along. Okay. So within sociology, there's really kind of three main theories that we'll discuss in this class. Okay. And if you've done social work or type classes, you probably have heard the term micro, macro, and then I forget what the meso levels of analysis is. Micro is the individual. Meso is the individual's, make sure I get this right, Tim, is the individual that person comes into regular contact with. And then macro is those overall cultural, societal, community norms and individuals. Did I summarize that right? Okay. And so this is also how in sociology they kind of treat these different theories and how they influence individuals. Okay. The first one, which is kind of this in between, it's kind of that meso mid theory, but also an overall theory, is what is known as the structural functional theory. This is the way each part of a society functions together to contribute to a whole. Okay. Um, but if you'll excuse me, I'm actually going to kind of explain structural versus functionalism. I'm going to kind of use two individuals within psychology. Okay. The first one is a person named Wilhelm Wundt. Known as the father of psychology because he opened one of the first psychological labs. We don't need to talk about that much, but one of the philosophies that he argued about is what is known as structuralism. Okay. And what he argued is if we know the structure of the mind, we know everything we need to know about the mind. Okay. So if I were to put this in modern terms, if you believe that by knowing um, your occipital lobe becomes active when you're looking at something, and that explains vision, that's a structuralist point of view. That all I need to know is what structure is there that gives to that existence. Okay. The other person, so that's the structural part of structural functional theory. Okay. On the other end of the stream, I can talk about William James, who is known as kind of the father of American psychology. He wrote one of the Tooth series, which became he was textbook for clear up into the 1950s. You still, if you go on with psychology, you will read it during your doctoral program. And so it's a book that really influenced how we view psychology here in the United States. He came up with something where he developed something known as functionalism. And basically, he said, I don't give a crap what the structure is. I don't care if it's your occipital lobe. I don't care if it's, if we go to Freud, if it's your id or your ego. I care what its purpose is. Why do we see in the first place? Why do we have emotions? What is their function? Okay. And so functionalism wants to know what the function of a given thing is. So when we combine this within societies and cultures, we want to know, for example, we have a structure called the legal system, right? And within that structure, we have policing, we have uh, corrections, quote unquote, and you have the judicial system. And for a structuralist, they would stop there and say that system works because those structures are in place. But functionalism, which takes the next step forward, would say, why do we have all three of those components? What function does policing have? What function does the judicial system have? What functions does corrections have? What does it do to make the broader society work? What function does it exist within? Okay. And in that, we will explore a lot of differences. Okay. So, for example, when we going off of the legal system, what is the function of the legal system? Because it differs based on culture. Okay. So, for example, here in the United States and in Britain, our legal system and our government system developed the Hobnerian interpretation of human nature of evil and good. The Hobnerian version of why people do bad things is because that's their natural state. That people are born to be self-centered, egotistical, self-gratifying, and left unbound, they're willing to aggress and be quote unquote evil to other people. And the purpose of government, especially the legal system, is to repress those people's natural tendencies to be evil. So when you look at the correction system here in the United States, it's about policing, it's about controlling people's behavior. And when person does something illegal, we separate them, we isolate them, and because they're evil, the punishment system is what should work the best. That you should punish a person for being their natural person and not giving in to the controls of that government system. Okay, that's really an American, Britain, English. Hobbes was a very much stout English person, and we really have adopted those attitudes. But if we look at Nordic countries, let's say Denmark and Sweden, what are some of the other ones? The Netherlands. They took on a French philosopher's idea known as Rousseau. Okay. Rousseau made an argument, and we won't get into it. He made an argument that people are born actually good. We're born altruistic. We're born wanting to help other people as well as that, because that will also help us. Okay. And he saw that, and his basis of this is he saw the goodness in nature. So he felt humans are of nature, therefore humans are good. And he felt that when people do something wrong, it's because they've deviated from their natural state and who they are meant to be. And that's what creates criminal behavior, all of those things that are negative. So if you go to a country, for example, in Denmark, and you end up in one of their prisons, it's more like you spend time in a hotel suite, a very comfortable space. There's usually not locks on any of the doors. There's places to go and meditate and be. There's people there that want to encourage them to be part of communal things, because their philosophy is you don't need a government to tell you how to be good. The purpose of government is to help you be who you are, and be the person within the community where you belong and where you're at in your space. And so theirs isn't a punishment system. Theirs is a welcome back system. Okay. So from a functional perspective, this is why we study why they function. They look the same. They both have laws, rules, judicial system, policing system, correction systems, but the function of them is different based upon the philosophies that those countries have adopted. Now, I will say, and we'll get into this when we get into social deviance, what system maybe works the best, and I leave this up to your judgment. One way we can measure this is something called recidivism rates. Okay. A recidivism rate is the probability of someone going back to jail or prison after their first arrest or first jailing or being put in prison. Okay. So the probability here in the United States and in Britain is 60%. People have a 60% of probability of going to jail or prison after their first stint. Okay. So that's how our punishment system is working. In Denmark is probably the best example because they actually record these things. In Denmark, the recidivism rate is 10%. And I'm willing to bet for most Americans that does not make sense. You mean if I go commit a crime, I'm going to kind of just basically go on this mini vacation? And that doesn't make sense within a functional cultural view that most people who live in the United States make. Most of the time when I mention this, students are like, I'd just commit crimes all the time if I live there. Why would I not? But again, it's based on a difference of a cultural view. Here we think people do bad things because they're bad persons. So if we reward them for that, they're just going to do more bad things. And that's how our system of thought works. In their system of thought works, people do bad things because they've lost their way, and our job is to bring them back. And so it's a different view of thinking of human nature and the difference of function between that society and this society. Okay. So that's kind of how the structural functional approach works. Um, on the macro level, we do have the conflict theory, which we kind of expressed in our two themes. This is the inequality contributing to social difference and perpetrated difference because of differences in power. Okay. And we'll get more into this, I think, probably next Thursday when we look at some feminist theories and some other theories dealing with race and ethnicity. So there's a couple sub theories to this one that kind of will kind of give more highlight to what conflict is besides what we just talked about. And then on the micro level is what's known as symbolic interactionism. And this is that one-on-one interaction is how do I communicate to you what sociology is? Well, we're using language, we're using PowerPoints. We're going to do maybe some assignments where you will explore it on your own. But it's all based on symbols, right? If I did my PowerPoint in Klingon, you probably wouldn't understand it, right? Or I use that because some of you might know Chinese and stuff, so I use a different example.
Writing paper.
Yeah, that would be interesting. I had a professor do that once. It was when they used to use that overhead thing, and he just write it, or he would just have these paragraphs. Annoying. Anyways, I hope if my PowerPoints are annoying, let me know. All right. So these are the three theories. The importance of the symbolic interaction, as we will see later in the course, is it really can shape people's perspectives of the world. Okay. So when we get to this section, we're going to talk about how is it a person can go and go into a battle, for example, and shoot the person that across to them who they don't even know. Okay. Well, if we humanize them, we wouldn't do it. Okay. If we saw the person that we want to aggress towards as an actual human being with family and friends and feelings and emotions, we would have a very hard time pointing a gun at them and shooting. Okay. But if I dehumanize them through using symbols and interaction, then I then can distance myself and not see them as human. So, for example, current attitudes towards people of Islam, they're mop heads, they're towel heads. You take away that humanness of them and not see them as a person. If we look at Vietnam, they were the gooks, right? I believe Nazis called Americans pigs. Um, and we come up with all of these terms to give a different meaning to another person. Now, I'm talking about the negative end of life, but if you think about anyone that you truly hate and you don't like, you probably give them non-human terms. You don't grant them the same humanity that you grant yourself. And same with people who don't like you. Okay. So symbolic interactionism, what its aim is on an individual level, how can I get you to like her? Not in a weird way, but friends. How do I get you guys to work together? Well, I humanize both of you. I give you both human qualities. How do I get you to hate each other? I start calling you a non-human name and I start calling you a non-human name, and then you both stop seeing each other as human. You guys are laughing at each other. Nah, we both like and don't like each other. No, I'm kidding. There's sometimes he's this and some. No, I'm kidding. But the point being is that we often use symbols to grant people humanity or not humanity. And we'll talk about that a lot when we get to symbolic interactionism, but we'll also talk about it a lot about what drives on a sociological level. Again, kind of going back to things that we talked about with conflict theory, what drives people to gain other support against another group. And we'll talk about the use of symbols and language and words to kind of grasp this idea. And again, I hope that through our interactions, we will see that these do not need to exist in reality. All they have to do is exist in the mind. Okay, going clear back to things that keep a society together, such as the classroom example, to making people do awful things. It doesn't need to exist in reality. It only needs to exist in the human mind. Okay, and so we'll look at that as we move through the class. All right. I think this is a fine start. Okay, I'm going to stop recording